and welcome to Election Exchange and Indianomics special. Well, the country's polity has clearly been reset. For the first time in 30 years, we have one party returned with an absolute majority. For the first time ever, a chief minister with a 10-year successful track record of administration and economic development will be prime minister. And thirdly, for the first time in a long time, the prime minister is his own man, owing nothing to any political heavyweight inside or outside his own party. But does unprecedented political stability necessarily mean higher growth is the question we are asking. And joining me are three economists from three financial centers across the world. BAHNU of UBS joins from London, TUSHAR PODDAR from Goldman Sachs joins from Mumbai, and JAHANGIR AZIZ of JPMORGAN joins from Singapore. Gentlemen, welcome. Well, TUSHAR, let me start with a man who is in this city and in the country. Would you say it is a never-before situation that we have in the polity, majority for one party and an experienced, successful chief minister at the helm? Can this give growth a huge dividend in the first year itself?
I think it is definitely a historic verdict, and it is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the new government to put India back on the growth path. I think the effects of this is going to be more medium-term in nature. It does sort of take away any major downside risks in the near term, which could have come about if we did not get this verdict, for instance. But I really think that the full impact of this verdict will be felt over the next 3 to 5 years, rather than immediately.
So in that case, Tushar, what is your GDP estimate for the current year, and are you revising up your forecast at least for FY16?
So our estimate for this year is 5.5%, but really it's next year, fiscal year 16, where we have a forecast of 6.5%, which is a pretty significant increase over the growth that we've seen in the fiscal year that just ended. Nearly a 200 basis point increase in growth. We were expecting a result like this, so we have not increased our growth numbers. Clearly, the impact of this election and the anticipation that this government will undertake reforms is behind that improvement in growth. So 6.5 is the number that we are going with for FY16, and that is a pretty substantial pickup in growth between now and next year.
I agree, but let me toss this to Jahangir now. Jahangir, do you see yourself upping your GDP forecast for this year itself, or even for FY16 anytime soon?
No, I do think that, look, I mean, if this government comes back very quickly with an economic policy team that says, look, these are the binding constraints and these are the policies that we will adopt, I think the fact that this government, or at least the Prime Minister, has demonstrated over the last 15 years that he is capable of delivering decisive leadership and implementing those things. I think even if the articulation is done, I think that will be sufficient for us to say that at least in the latter half of this fiscal year, or at least in the last quarter of the fiscal year, we will see corporate investment, which is really critically, which is what we really are talking about, will meaningfully move up.
Yeah, but JP Morgan's current GDP estimate for the current year is 5.3. Are you saying you may upgrade it by the second half of this year or by the last quarter?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, but again, we need to see what these reforms are, what these policy direction are. I mean, they don't have to tell us, that, I'm going to do A, B, and C over here, there, etc. But as long as they tell us what the direction of policies will be, what the direction reforms will be, I think that should be sufficient to get a sense of, maybe not in the third quarter, maybe in the fourth quarter, you will see a turnaround. I think that's one thing. And the other thing, in our view, is that much will depend, of course, on the global economy, but that's something that the government really doesn't have very much control over. But if it gets some tailwind from the global economy, and if it manages to put a reasonably credible policy framework. And that will, of course, include something, we haven't spoken about, but their views about growth-inflation trade-off. I think that will clearly help us in pushing up or changing our views on, even in 2014 fiscal year's growth forecast.
Can you elaborate on this growth-inflation trade-off?
So if you look at we've gone through this a number of times, Latha, that, RBI versus Ministry of Finance, growth versus inflation, that there is this trade-off that exists, and that, the Ministry of Finance wants growth and RBI wants lower inflation, etc., etc., etc. In reality, there is no growth-inflation trade-off. In reality, there hasn't been a growth-inflation trade-off in India or in any other country at inflation levels which are this high. So there has to, allowing RBI, in fact, I would say that the high inflation in itself is one of the critical binding constraints to sustain medium-term growth. So I think if the government is able to articulate that they trust the RBI in bringing down inflation to the 4, 5, 6% inflation levels, and that they will, they are completely behind RBI in doing so, and that itself is a constraint that needs to be removed before India can see high, sustained medium-term growth, I think we would be very pleasantly surprised.
Okay, no, let me get back to this, political stability growth equation with BAHNU as well. BAHNU, I'll make this question a little more difficult. India's scourge for the past 4 years has been low growth and high inflation. Why should a stable government be able to reverse this?
It's a really interesting question. India does need animal spirits to come back. I mean, local corporates have not been investing for some time, and many investment projects have been stuck at the state level. So it's a good question, because you need the state level cooperation to go through for an investment cycle to revive. I think with this sort of a mandate, the pull for state cooperation will be slightly higher. As I'm sure you realize, BJP doesn't have its government in many states, and in the upper house as well, they don't have a majority, so it will be difficult for them to pass legislation that will be immediately growth enhancing. But I think the fact that many local investment houses can increase their investments, the capex cycle can come back. I think inflation is a little more difficult problem. I mean, sequentially inflation has been coming off, but the fact that we have had supply side inflation for some time now, and the fact that we might have El Nino for a little while, even if it's a modest one, is a little bit of a worry. So I think on the inflation front, we'll have to wait a little bit to see whether we can see actually CPI coming off. WPI is giving us some decent signals. But in terms of the investment cycle, I think domestic investment can pick up very modestly. Debt levels are high. At this minute, NPAs are quite high, so credit growth is not likely to increase in a big way. This should mean that the improvement in capital investments is modest and slow, but it should pick up from out here, Latha, because of just how weak the base is. If you looked at industrial production numbers, we've not just been in recession, this has been outright stagnation for a long time. So it's not going to take much for this to improve. Inflation has been very high because of supply side factors, but I think sequentially it is coming off. So I think the primary reason for a cyclical rebound right now could be a very, very weak base. So we might confuse the causality in terms of BJP or NDA government leading to a big rebound, but it's the fact that we're coming from a very low base. It's next year where the real gains from reform, if we see reform, are likely to be manifest.
And what do you mean by these reform?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? So people expect different kinds of reform in the short term and the medium term. Obviously, in the short term, we want to see all the projects that have been stalled. We want to see those projects going through. So wherever we have some capacity to increase growth, increase capital expenditure, that needs to go through. But in terms of medium-term reforms, the market has been focused on GST, on Aadhaar, and also the freight corridor. But in my opinion, the single most important reform, and the good news is that this government has referred to it, although not addressed it very directly, but they have referred to it in their campaigning, is labour market reform. A point that I've made consistently is that India is at a very serious risk of completely frittering away its demographic dividend because of its complete lack of ability to improve its manufacturing sector. And that boils down to labour market policies in India. So this reform, this mandate, I should say, gives us one chance to change that. It's not going to be easy, but I think the authorities know what the problems are, and the strength of this mandate actually gives us the first opportunity in a long, long time to change that. That is the reform that I'm looking to see for India to improve its share in manufacturing, not just in capital-intensive manufacturing, as it is doing right now, but particularly in labor-intensive manufacturing. That's what India needs to do to crystallize its demographic dividend, for its demographics to be a positive rather than a drag on growth through weak fiscal forever.
You know, that's very well argued, but BAHNU, I can't remember the government, the BJP manifesto speaking so strongly about labour reform, but we'll have to wait and see. Let me get back to the growth argument with Tushar. You know, Tushar, you spoke about a 6.5% GDP growth in FY16. Where is this confidence springing? Don't you worry that a lot of the problems are actually stuck with the states or with the courts? I mean, even yesterday, the Supreme Court banned mining in Odisha. Where is this confidence of 6.5% coming?
So let me take a step back and say that one of the preconditions for having growth and a pickup in growth is to have a handle on inflation. This is a point that Governor Rajan has made quite convincingly, is that first we have to sort of reduce the inflationary pressures in the economy, and some of those measures have to do with the fiscal side. For instance, the rural subsidies that we've seen over the past few years has clearly had an impact on rural inflation. There's really no slack in the rural labor market when rural wages have been growing at 17% on average. So a new government would have to scale back some of those subsidies, cut back on the fiscal, get inflation back on track, thereby allowing greater freedom for monetary policy to start easing rates, which can then kickstart the process of growth. So I think that is the critical macro dynamic. Of course, the micro dynamics that you mentioned on clearing projects and bottlenecks at the state level would involve greater policy coordination, greater decision making, and most importantly, leadership. And if this government has the same energy level that they showed during the campaign, I would be very optimistic about their ability to kickstart some of these projects that you mentioned and start seeing some revenues and growth coming from those projects. But going back, I think the biggest issue is inflation. We have to, the first thing that the new government should tackle is get a handle on inflation if they want growth to accelerate in 2015 and beyond.
You know, that is exactly the point Jahangir is also making, Tushar. But you know, is the BJP showing that much of a penchant for cutting subsidies? They are also in favour of food subsidies, even when the argument happened in Parliament. It's there in the manifesto. What if the new government persists with the same wide deficit? Then all your bets are off?
I mean, that is a little bit speculative in nature at this stage. I would say a couple of things. One is that the new government will know coming in how big inflation is as an issue, both politically and economically. They've just fought an election on the inflation issue. So they will be mindful of the fact that loose fiscal policy can lead to higher inflation. So I don't think that is operating in an island where they're not taking into account what has happened over the last 4 years. There is, of course, two aspects of the inflation control. One is the demand management policies that I talked about, and the other one is to boost supply. Now, the policies that this government may take is to boost the supply and not necessarily reduce demand. So then we would have to see the policy mix. Can they actually accelerate the supply side in a fast enough fashion? For instance, in the power sector, the infrastructure sector, the coal and gas inputs, and all the micro issues that you were talking about. If they can accelerate that supply side, maybe we won't need demand contraction on the fiscal side. But my inclination is that you need a bit of both. You need to compress some of the demand side and boost the supply side if you want to get a meaningful reduction in inflationary pressures.
Well, Tushar, you know, I am with you and Jahangir on that, but there is already a lot of speculation in the media with some BJP leader quoting as saying that higher interest rates are not working, and even a face-off between, a potential face-off between government and RBI on that. Bhanu, you know, actually, since you are in London at the financial epicenter, just a word on this speculation. If the RBI governor, you know, was arm-twisted too much to not raise rates, and if he left, how would the financial markets take it?
Yes, of course, I think the market will take it very badly if that were to happen. But let me tell you, unless I've missed something completely, I have absolutely no grounds to expect that to happen. There is no data point that suggests that there's going to be tremendous pressure on Governor Rajan to cut rates aggressively to boost growth. I think, you know, some of the issues that this government has campaigned along have been issues like inflation, and that's what Governor Rajan is trying to fight. So I'd be very surprised if there's tremendous pressure brought to bear on him, and as a result of which he leaves. So I think if that were to happen, the negative payoff from that is extremely high. But I just think that the probability of that is quite low. I have no basis for expecting that whatsoever.
No, we have no basis either, but I just thought I'll toss it to you as a speculative position. Let's take a break now, gentlemen. Thereafter, back from the break, we will discuss the rupee and what may be the new problems on the external front.